My first contact with Hungary came when I was a young man, 34 years old, and I was working for Goldman Sachs at a time when Goldman Sachs was a good name and not a bad name. I had just become a partner of the firm, and my wife and I decided to go to Europe. It was our first trip to Europe, and I was 34 at the time. And we were in Vienna, one of the stops on our first visit to Europe. Having breakfast in Vienna with a young friend, and in the middle of the breakfast, there burst in the door of the little restaurant where we were eating what turned out to be a Hungarian freedom fighter who had left his unit the day before and had fled to find my friend in Vienna and beg for his help. The 1956 was the year in which Hungary revolted against Soviet occupation, encouraged to some extent by the United States to do so. And now they were losing the battle, and the freedom fighters were arrayed around the country in different little pockets of resistance, but it became clear that they weren't going to prevail over the Russian tanks that had been sent into Budapest to put down the revolution. But I listened to this with some interest. It was an exciting moment to have a freedom fighter right there having a cup of coffee with us in Vienna. And I was so impressed by his story. He didn't speak English, but it was easily translated what he was saying by my friend in English so that my wife and I could hear it. And we, after hearing the sad plot, and he was appealing for radios, walkie-talkies, with which they could communicate, these little groups could communicate with each other. They were appealing for outboard motors so that more of them could escape across the lake that is the border between the two countries. Bandages, medicines, all of these things they needed desperately. And my wife and I were so impressed that we decided to cut short our vacation, fly back to New York, and gather together these supplies that were so desperately needed by the freedom fighters. My name was not well known to the heads of the companies that manufactured these things, but Goldman Sachs was a well-known company, and when I said I was a partner of Goldman Sachs, I didn't have to say how new and young I was. I begged him, the head of RCA, General Sarnoff, to supply us with the radio equipment, which he said he would do and did. I called Outboard Marine, a client of Goldman Sachs, and spoke to the head of it and said we needed outboard motors for the freedom fighters, and he said yes, and he performed. I talked to Merck and Pfizer people, and they agreed to supply the medicine equipment that we needed. And then I called the head of Pan American, a very distinguished fellow, and appealed to him to let us have a freight plane to fly this stuff back promptly into Vienna. And he agreed to do that. And so about 3 days after I landed back in New York, I found myself on a plane going back to Vienna, a plane loaded with all these supplies that were so desperately needed. We landed the plane at the far side of the airport, and my friend that I was breakfasting with had supplied trucks to truck the material to the lakefront and put them on barges. And I watched while the stuff was loaded on the barges, and so and so the material got back into Hungary very quickly, as needed, and I felt quite proud of myself. On the way back, I realized I had broken about 100 laws in the process. I had interfered with the policy of the United States, the foreign policy of the United States, which was illegal for a citizen to do. I had landed supplies without license at the wrong side of an airport without any authority to do so. And so all of these things were sins that I had committed and laws that I had broken. And I didn't tell this story for a long time until I was assured that the statute of limitations had expired and that I was no longer in jeopardy. So that was my first experience with Hungary. And I looked around in New York for an organization that was involved with the refugees in Hungary. And I found a little tiny organization called the International Rescue Committee and joined its board. Having had this experience that I had had, I was an eager new member of their board. And they were saving refugees from Hungary, rescuing them and bringing many of them back to the United States. And they helped many Hungarians flee back to the United States, many of whom have become valuable citizens of America in the years since, and I believe have added to the mixed culture of America with a huge influx of Hungarian refugees that followed the 1956 revolution. And the International Rescue Committee I stayed involved with, and they continued to be involved with Hungary, but with many other countries around the world where people were being oppressed and where the people fled from their homes, and the International Rescue Committee rescued them and brought them to the United States, taught them English, and helped them resettle, got them jobs, found them homes, and got them jobs in the United States. After I retired from Goldman Sachs in 1984, President Reagan and George Shultz was Secretary of State, asked me to come to Washington and be Deputy Secretary of State, number 2 to George Shultz in the State Department. I was honored by this and couldn't say no. And when I got there, and after I had had a few months of learning the ropes of being a State Department high-level officer, I was assigned to the special responsibility of covering Eastern Europe for the State Department. And I began to go back to Hungary, a country that I had fallen in love with a bit in earlier years. And this was now, I was Deputy Secretary from 1985 to 1989, and went to Hungary, I suppose, 6 or 8 times during that period, and to all the other countries of Eastern Europe. They were then all headed by puppet governments installed by the Russians, and not representing the people of Hungary, for example, at all. A man named Kadar was the Soviet puppet leader of Hungary, and I tried to get, most of these countries welcomed a visitor, even though we were from what was then an enemy country, and a high-level visitor, though, they recognized as a distinguished figure, and the only American government representative that had visited them in a number of years. I had been eager to make those visits. And when I got to Budapest, President Kadar said, no, he wouldn't meet with me because he didn't meet with anybody with deputy in their title. And so he had me meet with the deputy head of Hungary, a man who previously in life was a tailor, and had no government experience, but he was a communist and had been elected by the government to be a high-level government official. And I remember that I found out that he was not a full-fledged tailor in his civilian life. He was only a pants tailor. He didn't have the stature to be a full-fledged tailor. And so that was my first visit to Hungary, but President Kadar did meet with me in my second visit. And I visited in these trips all of the countries of Eastern Europe, Poland and Romania and Bulgaria and Czechoslovakia and all of the Eastern European countries with the same message. You countries really belong in Western Europe. And someday you're going to have to be back in Western Europe. Now, this was a very dangerous thing to say in these countries because they were entirely under the domination of the Soviets, who were definitely our enemy in the Cold War. But this fell on ears that believed it, but were not in a position to really admit that they accepted it. But several times in several countries, the head of state would meet with me and deny that any of these things were true, and send me on my way with no satisfaction. But then on the way out, they would beckon to me to stay around, and my little staff that accompanied me on the trip left the room, and I was left alone with the Soviet puppet leader. And he said, you talked about little steps of friendship. And he said, what did you mean by that? And I said, well, just to take an example, you have imprisoned a journalist, an American journalist, that you said was violating the, was filing anti-government stories back to America, and you have put him in jail for treason, and he is coming up for trial. And we Americans find that that's extremely offensive. We believe in free journalism, and so that's what he was doing. It's not his fault. He was following orders from his journalist newspaper. And we would like very much to have you simply find a way to release him and let him return to the United States. Release him with the understanding that he will leave Hungary and come back to the United States. And in return for that, we would like to offer you, for example, and I use this as an example, a slight reduction of our tariff on the importation of Hungarian wine, which is now 50%, and we will reduce that to 45% and encourage more sales of Hungarian wine in the United States. And I said, you don't have to say yes or no to me. Just remember that that's a goodwill offer. And if I read in the papers or hear from anyone that you have released our journalist, I will see to it that we will lower our tariff on Hungarian wine by 5%. Well, it happened. 2 weeks later, I read that Hungary had released the journalist from prison and that he was due back in the United States. He was expelled from Hungary and coming back to the United States. He'd found it possible to do that, and I had arranged with the Tariff Commission that I had authority to make that reduction in the tariff, and it was made. In fact, that reduction in the tariff was good too, because we were eager to do more trade with these Central European countries, Eastern European countries, and so this allowed them to do more trade with us at a lower price of the tariff that would be imposed on their exports to us. So that was the kind of thing that was happening all through Eastern Europe with almost all these countries. I made no progress with Ceausescu of Romania. He was an evil man, and I had some interesting talks with him and came to hate him like everybody else who knew him came to do. But I made no progress with him. And Eastern Germany's government was difficult too, and although always courteous and reasonably friendly, we never really made any progress. But with these other countries, we began to, they began to beg me for bigger steps, not little steps, bigger steps. And we even joked about their retiring from the Warsaw Pact as being a major, that was a treaty in which they had agreed that if the Soviet Union invaded any other countries, that they would join the rebellion and fight on the side of the Soviet Union, something that most of them were horrified at the idea of having to do. So in any event, progress was made, and when finally Gorbachev threw in the towel and realized that he could no longer prevail in this Cold War on the United States and changed, the Eastern European countries were one of the reasons that caused him to change, because he began to realize that he no longer could count on their cooperation to be allies with them in any further advances that they made into other countries in the region. So I was very proud of that. And after I was through with my period in office, and George Bush the First was in office, he invited me to become the chairman of the Hungarian American Enterprise Fund, Hungarian American Enterprise Fund, a business organization in which the U.S. government was putting up, in the case of Hungary, $60 million for us to invest in Hungary, new enterprises that were springing up in Hungary, and to teach Hungarians who had gone a whole generation without there being any private sector businesses, to teach them how to start a new company and how to get it going and make a profit and make it successful and employ Hungarians in the process. And so we operated the Hungarian American Enterprise, I and others, for some years, and that was a further contribution to Hungary. And I've stayed in touch with subsequent governments in Hungary and visited maybe once every couple of years. So I'm well acquainted in Hungary and with its political leaders that have been in office over the years, all freely elected, all friendly with the United States, and it's a thrill for me to think back over my life and how long I've been involved with Hungary.